Good evening. My name is Jill Savitt. I'm the acting director of the Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide here at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. It is my great honor to welcome you here for this important and sadly all too timely discussion about the horrors unfolding against the Rohingya community, a Muslim minority group of people in Burma. Tonight you will hear about the worst of the worst type of crime, the attempt to eliminate and erase a people, genocide. On Monday, the museum took the rare step of announcing that, based on our analysis, there is compelling evidence that the Burmese military has committed ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and genocide against the Rohingya. As an institution, we do not come to this conclusion lightly. Part of our work at the Simon-Skjodt Center is to sound the alarm when we see early warning signs of genocide anywhere in the world. 4 years ago, we did just that in the case of the Rohingya. We issued a report outlining the clear presence of early warning signs of genocide in Burma and brought these findings to those in a position to do something. This warning by the museum and others was not heeded. Just over a year ago, in August 2017, the Burmese military and others unleashed a ruthless, massive attack against the Rohingya, using mass killing, rape, arson, arbitrary arrest and detention, and forced displacement of 700,000 people. Again, we sounded the alarm. We issued reports and met with officials at all levels of the US government to prod meaningful action. We brought Rohingya victims and survivors to these conversations, and yet there has been, with few exceptions, no meaningful response. The lack of action would be tragic in any case, but this is not a crime of the past, however recent. Right now, as we gather here tonight, the Rohingya still in Burma continue to be at risk. Those who have been displaced to Bangladesh cannot safely return home, and there has been no significant change in Burma's policy or rhetoric that would suggest that the situation has improved. Tonight, in addition to hearing from Tun Khin, a Rohingya leader, you will meet some of Burma's victims and survivors on the walls of our building. These portraits by photojournalist Greg Constantine show the humanity and the dignity of the Rohingya, and we hope they motivate you, as they do us, to make sure those in power do all they can to protect the Rohingya now. We hold this event mindful that this weekend marks the 70th anniversary of the adoption of the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, which was a milestone achievement, a moment when the global community came together and declared it would do all in its power to prevent a tragedy such as the Holocaust from happening again. As tonight's event proves, that promise has not been realized. Changing that dynamic is the work and purpose of our center. We do this in our research, our engagement with policymakers, and our quest for justice for victims. We do this to put into action the words of the museum's founder, Elie Wiesel, who said, "A memorial unresponsive to the future would violate the memory of the past." In marking the anniversary of the Genocide Convention and to remind us all of our commitment to be a living memorial, I want to introduce you to a Holocaust survivor and a volunteer here at the museum, Irene Weiss. After Irene speaks, we will move on to our panel discussion, which will be moderated by my colleague, Naomi Kikoler, the Deputy Director of the Simon-Skjodt Center. Please now welcome Irene Weiss.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Holocaust Museum for organizing this event and understanding what a critical issue this is for all of us. As a survivor of the Holocaust, I have experienced firsthand the results of hate and bigotry. When I see photographs and read reports about thousands of Rohingya civilians fleeing their homes due to religious persecution, it brings me back to another time when my family and millions of other Jewish people were persecuted because of our religion. When I was 13 years old, my family and I were forced out of our home in Hungary and deported to the Auschwitz extermination camp, where my parents, 4 of my siblings, and most of my relatives were killed upon arrival. During my 8 months in Auschwitz, my 17-year-old sister and I were used as slave labor and forced to work and live next to the crematorium. Day and night, columns of young mothers with children and elderly men and women took their last steps as they passed by our barracks. We watched them enter the gate that led to the gas chamber. My brain could not absorb what I was seeing. I thought that this place must not be on this earth, and that if people knew this existed, they would stop it. Our pain and suffering was sharpened by the hopeless feeling that we had been abandoned, first by our government and our neighbors, and then by the rest of the world. Of course, it's now clear that much of the world did know about the persecution of the Jews. World leaders knew about Auschwitz and the other extermination camps. But the killing continued. It is tragic that over 70 years later, the world again looks on as the regime in Burma commits hideous atrocities against its own citizens. For Holocaust survivors, this museum is a place where our past is understood. It is a place where we can give voice to those who perished, and it is an opportunity to educate people about this tragic period in our history. The museum is also a place where we learn about present persecution and genocide. I am proud to be affiliated with the museum as a survivor volunteer and to join my voice in its effort to educate the public about the crimes against humanity being committed against Rohingya civilians and the civilian population of other countries around the world. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Irene, for your incredibly powerful words. I think everyone gathered here today has to be gathered with a certain degree of sorrow to think that we really should not be here. Over 70 years after the Holocaust, after the commitment to never again, we find both you and Tun Khin bound by a similar experience, that of being survivors of genocide. I'm very honored today to be joined by Tun Khin, the president of the Burmese Rohingya organization of the UK, by Greg Constantine, whose incredible photos you've seen and will continue to see in the course of the evening, by Olivia Enos, a policy analyst from the Heritage Foundation, and by Greta Van Susteren, the host of Voice of America's Plugged In with Greta Van Susteren. Everyone on this stage has spent the last few years, if not decades, trying to put a spotlight on the plight of a community that has faced persecution and genocide. I think one of the things that we want to make sure that people understand is the violence that took place in August of 2017 and the photos that you most recently saw from the latest exodus of the Rohingya is only the tip of a much larger iceberg that accumulated in that violence. And I wanted to maybe start by helping to set the context for people in the room and for those watching. And if Tun Khin, you could share a little bit of your own personal story of how it came to be that you left Burma when you were 16, and then also what has subsequently happened to your community.
First of all, thank you very much to United States Holocaust Memorial Museum organizing this event. And I'm a Rohingya. I left from Arkan State when I was 16. And when I was in Arkan, I have seen this persecution, and we are glad finally international community recognizing it. But this genocide going on for many decades. So let me bring, when I was young, I was denied to go to university, and I faced restrictions on movement. I was denied to move from one village to another. And I have seen my eldest brother's friends, they were denied to get married. And I have seen, they're not allowed to get more than 2 children when I was in Arkan State. And I have seen that for when my age was until 16 in Arkan State. Even though, my grandfather was a member of parliament, my mother's grandfather was the first judge in Northern Arkan, I did not get a birth certificate. And my father's NRC and the card being taken away. Whatever document we have, it's been taken away. It's not only my family. Many Rohingyas in Arkan State, for decades, I have seen that serious denial of restriction of movement, restriction of marriage. They denied the right to have food and children, denied the right to have children, denied the right to have medical treatment. This is going on for many decades. That's what I have seen since I was young. Today, after I was living 21 years, I'm witnessing that mass killings and much more serious worsening situation. So until now today, I can say that genocide is ongoing. Why I received some calls yesterday and last week from the IDP camps. The people are preparing to leave from the IDP camps. These people have been already 6 years now in Sittwe IDP camp. They're not allowed to go to Sittwe hospital. There is no medical treatment for them. And they can't get education. So same thing, the way the people be unbearable situation. This is in IDP camps. When you look at Northern Arkan, where the largest Rohingyas are living, they are not allowed to go to paddy field. They can't go to market. And so what's happening is, it's been locked up. The people become unbearable, and military rounding up them. And whenever they leave, they just, with false allegation, killed by security forces and arresting and demanding big bribe. That is what the situation. So until now, even the people are, why these people, like yesterday you may have seen, some of you, the boat arrived to Indonesia, one boat, and last 3 weeks ago, there were 3 boats left. So the people are living by boat, risking their lives to live. Why? The genocide is ongoing, unbearable situation they are facing in Arkan State.
Thank you, Tun Khin. Maybe if we are able to go back to the map just to help again set the context. There's over 130 ethnic and religious minorities that live in Burma. Many of them have been targeted and have been the victims of crimes against humanity, war crimes perpetrated by the same perpetrator, by the Burmese military. And what we've even seen more recently in the violence that happened in August of 2017 is the same military units that have attacked others in Kachin and Karen and elsewhere have been involved in the attacks on the Rohingya as well. And as Tun Khin mentioned, the population today, there's around 500,000 Rohingya that remain in Rakhine. When the attacks of August of 2017 took place, we saw the fastest migration and the largest migration of people out of a country since the Rwandan genocide, with over 700,000 people fleeing. They joined around 250, 300,000 Rohingya that had already fled previous waves of violence and were living in Bangladesh in an area called Cox's Bazar. So today, we as an institution feel very strongly that the Rohingya community within Burma are at risk of extinction within that country. And as Tun Khin mentioned, they're living under incredibly difficult circumstances. Greg, for the last 13 years, I mean, you've been a photojournalist for a long time, focusing on stateless communities around the world. For 13 years, you've focused on the plight of the Rohingya, and you've been documenting a genocide, but it's a genocide that you are unable to get into the country to help tell their story. Can you talk a little bit about what has compelled you to want to tell their story, to focus on, and what are the challenges that you have faced in the course of doing so?
Thank you. I think that I started my work on photographing the Rohingya in early 2006 and have been documenting this ongoing persecution of the community ever since then. I've been back to Bangladesh twice this year. I was there last year during the exodus of people out of Burma. But I think that, there's a number of different reasons why I have continued to keep documenting the atrocities against this community. One is that probably one of the biggest things is that this is persecution that has largely gone unnoticed from the international community for decades now. That just as Tun Khin was saying, that outside of slaughter or killing or the death of people, what's happened is that this invisible administrative human rights abuse has been perpetrated against this community for decades now. The denial of freedom of movement, the denial of the rights of citizenship, the denial of the rights of, you name every single rights that we would think we would have, and they've all been denied from this community by the Burmese government. And when you place that within a historical context of 12 years, it shows that genocide is not just some singular act of mass killing, but it's actually a process that has taken place over decades to eliminate and basically marginalize this community to a point to where they have no choice but to leave, or as we've seen last year, have physically been eradicated from the country that they call home. So for me as a photographer, it's been really important to not only photograph some of these more dramatic moments, like what we saw, these monumental moments in the history of this community like last year, but it's also been to show this series of events that actually are so important for people to recognize as being a part of this master plan that has been set aside and put in place by the Burmese government for decades now.
It's interesting. So we, as an institution, focus a lot on early warning, because one of the biggest lessons that we learned from the Holocaust is what happened to Irene was not something that simply emerged out of nowhere. It was, as you said, a very systematically planned exercise. There were warning signs. Warning signs included hate speech, efforts to dehumanize a population, physically segregate them, restrict them from access to university, medical care. And for those of us who work on these issues, we don't like to draw comparisons, but I have to say it is glaring to see, the Secretary of State Tillerson used the comment that it bore all the hallmarks of ethnic cleansing, what had happened to the Rohingya. I would say, well, it bears a lot of the hallmarks of what has happened in situations where we've had clear warning signs of genocide, and those warning signs have gone unheeded. In the context of the photos that you've taken, I was wondering if there were a few that you might want to just walk us through to share a little bit of the background on them.
Yeah, sure. What is being shown on the walls of the museum tonight and for the next few nights is work that was produced from September of 2017 to 2 trips to Bangladesh this year. This particular photograph, one of the things that I've tried to do as a photographer is to show that even though this enormous amount of violence was targeted towards the community last year, that actually death continues to still happen as a byproduct of what happened last year in 2017 as a result of the Burmese government's policies. That the deaths of people from the Rohingya community in Bangladesh as stateless refugees is actually should be linked directly to the actions of the Burmese government from last year. And this particular photograph is on my trip there in May and June of last year. Every day I would visit the same cemetery. There's 50-something cemeteries throughout all of the refugee camps where the Rohingya live in Cox's Bazar. And on my way to work every single day, I would pass by the same cemetery. And for 30 days straight, I stopped at the same cemetery every single day and would photograph a new grave that had been dug because of someone from the Rohingya community passing away, whether it be a baby passing away because of lack of medical care, or an elderly person who had died because of the stress or accelerated illness due to the camp conditions. And over the course of those 30 days, I came up with 17 new graves that had been dug in one cemetery out of 50-something during one particular month. And this is just one photograph of one of those new graves being dug in this one cemetery that I visited throughout the 1 month that I was there in May.
It's incredible. I wanted to just turn maybe, Greta, we've talked on this issue about the fact that there were clear warning signs. And those warning signs have been documented, they've been reported, we've issued reports. And in this particular situation, you only see the world act when you see the mass refugee flows. And the response is one of humanitarian assistance. And as Irene said, I think we felt that as long as the world knew what was happening in real time, we would see action a lot earlier. We'd see action in response to those warning signs. You've traveled now to the region 4 times. You've been trying to put a spotlight on this issue. How do you understand the lack of the international community's action in this regard?
Because they don't see it. I mean, I'll give a shout out to Amanda Bennett, the director of Voice of America. She's walked the camps. Why do you think that John Lippman helped us do this documentary on Rohingya? Because they've walked the camps, they've seen it. The U.S. media just isn't there, and they're not putting the spotlight. Well, and the simple, crude answer is because it's expensive. It's cheap to put people in a studio and complain about tweets. It's very expensive to send reporters out. And I know the journalists at all these news organizations. Nick Kristof of the New York Times has been there, and he's tried to put a spotlight on it in print. But it's expensive to do. People care, but these news organizations are not sending these people to go look at it. And because if you look at it, you're going to be sitting up on this stage and you're going to be talking about it all the time. But it is stunning that the American media has ignored this. Frankly, they could take one of Greg's pictures and just tweet it. It wouldn't cost a dime. I mean, and put the spotlight on it. But they've completely turned their back because they're just other more incendiary, perhaps locally, domestically, political stories that they can tweet about. But it's an absolute disgrace that when we go to the camp, when that Greg's not tripping all over reporters from every news organization because they're not there. And I really do. I'm grateful to have had the privilege. At least one of my trips was for Voice of America for the documentary. Others with an NGO, Samaritan's Purse. My other trips to the area. But it makes a difference if the boss walks the camp. It makes a big difference.
And Greg, you've been walking the camps and you've been trying to put a spotlight. And to that point that Greta mentioned about how people fly in right when there's a crisis and then disappear, I mean, how do you feel? I'm assuming part of the reason you keep wanting to tell the stories you said before is you want there to be action. How do you comprehend the?
Well, I mean, I think that, the fact is that journalists all over the world, and not just journalists from the United States, I mean, they're lacking resources to be able to do meaningful work. They have only short periods of time to be able to do it. And actually, when you do think about it, last year, there was an enormous amount of coverage from fellow journalists on this particular thing. But at the same time, this is a story that demands more than Greg, just breaking news.
Greg, you've got two Reuters reporters
exactly.
who are investigating mass graves of Rohingya in Rakhine State, in Burma, in Myanmar. 2 reporters, and they were set up by the police according to the testimony. They were fed some documents and at a dinner, and as soon as they went outside, the same police arrested them and said they shouldn't have had the documents. They're sitting in prison right now because the real reason is because they were investigating mass graves of Rohingya. How often do we hear about that? And these are reporters. Even the reporters aren't reporting about this.
Greta, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, Walon and Choso'o being in prison and being sentenced to 7 years is something that is intolerable, both internationally and also inside of Myanmar that claims that it's going through democratic.
And if you don't know about them, don't blame yourself. You blame the U.S. media. You know, don't blame them.
But I think going back to your question, for me, it has been to try to create this sustained long-term documentation of what's happened to this community over more than a decade. Yeah. And it's been to use that work to then spark people to have a deeper sense of understanding and meaning as to all the different facets of this story and just how tragic and prolonged it is. I mean, that has been primarily my role, I think, as a photographer with this story for 13 years now.
And it's interesting because increasingly we are also seeing lawyers joining that effort and documentation efforts being undertaken, including one that was initiated almost a year ago by the U.S. Department of State, which was an incredibly robust effort undertaken actually with the help of some people in this room to gather information and to try to systematically analyze the nature of the crimes that have taken place. The purpose of that was to, one, try to help galvanize internal U.S. government responses, but also to help inform the international community's efforts. And what's been really incredible is I can't think of the last time where I've worked on a situation, even when I think about having worked on ISIS and the genocide that was committed there, where you really do have as much material and where you have so many organizations. The United Nations has come out and said that they believe that genocide was committed. Just 2 weeks ago, the head of an international independent fact-finding mission established by the UN Human Rights Council came out and said that it's an ongoing genocide. And I was wondering, Olivia, there's a part of this conversation that is very much a policy conversation. And you've been writing a lot about the future of U.S. policy on Burma and also the specific question about recognizing the commission of genocide. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you think it's so important for the U.S. government to make a determination like that and some of the politics around it.
So I think that it's actually in the U.S. government's interest to go ahead and issue a determination on genocide. And the reason why I say this is because I think, in the wake, for example, of the U.S. pulling out of the Human Rights Council, some of the ways that the administration has handled other human rights issues, the international community has been left questioning whether or not the administration does care about human rights issues. And I think issuing a determination here is in the administration's interest, especially since credit should be given where credit is due. The U.S. is the top supplier of humanitarian assistance to the Rohingya crisis. They've, the U.S. government has supplied upwards of $400 million, nearing that already, but that is still falling far short of what the demands and the needs are of these individuals in the refugee camps. Beyond that, I think that it's an opportunity for the U.S. to communicate that we really care about atrocity prevention. I think some of this humanitarian assistance that's already been given can be sort of recharacterized as assistance directly to victims of genocide, to war crimes, to victims of crimes against humanity and otherwise. Beyond this, I think that from a State Department or a national security perspective, I think that there's a really strong interest in actually advancing this as a part of its broader Asia policy. The administration has a policy of free and open Indo-Pacific strategy in Asia, and that free and open bit should mean that we're promoting human rights for all people in Asia. And all people in the world, frankly. But beyond that, I think that there's also just an interest in going back and revisiting the administration's Burma policy overall, to look at ways to address what is the root cause of the problem, which is the Burmese military's impunity. That's led to so many other problems, not only the persecution of the Rohingya, but Naomi, as you mentioned, of course, the persecution of the Kachin and Christians in Shan State as well. And so I think it's an opportunity to revisit broader U.S. policy overall. My final point I want to make on this is just that I think that an additional reason why it's in the U.S. government interest to do so is that issuing a genocide determination that affirms what the UN has already said is genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes is hugely beneficial in that sense, but also it has the potential to increase burden sharing so that additional humanitarian assistance, not only from the US government, but from other countries can come, because we're a year out from the genocide taking place. And when that happens, you have donor fatigue. And so it's time for the US to really take a stand and be clear about what was committed against the Rohingya.
But I think we've got there are a couple of things, though, that are worth noting, is that it's not like the people in Congress and in our government have ignored this problem. There was a hearing before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and I testified before, and this was done before the election. Republicans and Democrats both showed up at this hearing about the Rohingya crisis, and believe me, they weren't going to get one political vote by showing up and talking about the Rohingya over in Bangladesh and Myanmar, but they showed up because they cared, Republicans and Democrats. They're voting next week in the House on a resolution to vote whether it is indeed genocide. Over on the Senate side of the Hill, Senator Dick Durbin, we've interviewed for Voice of America, and he's been over and looking at this issue with other members of the Senate as well, because he cares about it, and he's not going to get a vote doing this, but because it's the right thing to do. So people on the House and in the House and the Senate are doing. Vice President Pence got in the face of Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of Myanmar, just a few weeks ago on this very issue about this, and there's a question about whether her award should be pulled from. She's already lost a lot of awards around the world, but whether the Nobel Peace Prize should be pulled, she's had whether the award she got from Congress should be pulled. But our government isn't turning the back on it, and the whole problem of what you do is that we lifted the sanctions on Myanmar about 4 or 5 years ago, and the intention was because we thought that would promote greater democracy and would actually reverse some of the atrocities going on. It hadn't turned out that way, but the reason they were lifted is because the United States government, then it was the Obama administration, was looking at the problem. It's just that it really is an incredibly overwhelming one, and there is no perfect solution.
I think there's no perfect solution. I mean, I think it's important probably when we think about Congress, just this past week, the question of genocide in Burma was actually front and center in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Before a subcommittee, there was a hearing, a confirmation hearing actually for the potential future ambassador to Cambodia. And he's a foreign service officer, and Senator Rubio really pushed him on the question of what did the US government know when? What preventive strategies were put in place? What was the response, as you mentioned, when the sanctions were lifted as part of a process to try to promote democracy and instill kind of efforts around rule of law? 1 month later, there was a brutal and violent crackdown on the Rohingya, which led to a mass exodus at that point, and very little change in US policy in the immediate aftermath. So in the course of the questioning, Senator Rubio was asking, what compels there to be an actual shift in policy? And I think right now that's the question that we're diving into as well. And I'm just wondering, Tun Khin, from your perspective, how significant is it for you for the world to acknowledge the commission of the crimes that have been committed against you? You talked about the importance of the international community recognizing genocide. What does it mean? What does it mean to the communities that you are speaking on behalf of, and unfortunately have that burden of trying to advocate on behalf of 3 million Rohingya that are displaced in many places around the world?
Thank you. That is very important. Recognizing genocide is very important because Burmese government say, I'm not exist, like me, 3 million Rohingya not exist. So recognizing genocide from Holocaust, and that gave a kind of acknowledgement that we are exist, first thing. And secondly, we need to look at, it is important that this is going on for many decades. Rohingyas, the genocide is still ongoing. So it is important that we need to focus on how many years Rohingya been suffering. It is important, and we need to see. We have seen 700,000 people. What they want is they want to see justice. Their sisters been, I've been visited many times there. What they told me is they want justice, and they want to see international community serious action, bring justice and accountability, bring in military perpetrators to, Senior General Mi Aung Hlaing and others to justice. And also, it is important that if this is going on continuously, this can happen to other minorities in Burma.
Just curious, I mean, Greta mentioned before that in the US Congress, next week we might actually see a bill passed that acknowledges the Commission of Genocide, and we will likely probably see something like that happen in the next few months in the Senate side as well. And that will serve as a bit of an accountability and a check and balance on what the administration is doing, what the Department of State is doing, the National Security Council. And Olivia, I was just wondering if you can comment a little bit on some of the policy considerations. What are some of the tools that are available that they could actually enact? But also, there's been some interesting themes that have emerged, including in the conversations that we've had since making the announcement and prior to that, about why shifting or changing U.S. policy would be difficult. And a lot of those considerations center on questions around leverage, the relationship between Burma and China, certain assumptions, as Greta mentioned, about democracy and how democracy unfolds. I was wondering if you could just comment a little bit on both the tools, but also whether or not those kind of, how you regard those assertions.
Yeah. So I wanted to start off by saying that one thing that I think often gets lost when we're talking about a potential determination being made is that Secretary Pompeo could literally wake up tomorrow and decide and determine that genocide took place. But there are a variety of arguments that, for whatever reason, seem to be holding forward movement back. Some of the arguments, of course, have been things like, well, then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, called it ethnic cleansing, and maybe that's a good enough label. But we know that there are different legal implications for it being called ethnic cleansing versus genocide. Some of the other arguments that have come up is there's some concern that calling it an atrocity would undermine the democratic process, which has always been a cornerstone or a goal of U.S. foreign policy. But I think it's nearly impossible to move forward with an authentic democratic process if you don't acknowledge and identify directly what atrocities took place and then take steps to change that. And then, of course, we hear very frequently the argument that, well, Burma and China have a very close relationship. We worry that if we were to, for example, sanction Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, or if we were to actually issue this determination on genocide, then we would push Burma essentially into the arms of China. The reality is, for all countries in Asia, every country in Asia has a strong relationship with both China and the US, and that relationship isn't going to go away. It seems to me highly unrealistic to say that just because we would acknowledge what took place for what it is genocide, that somehow we would have no continuing relationship with Burma. That seems completely devoid of reality. And so I think we need to start pressing on these points that we have heard over and over again as arguments against them, and just remind the US government that truthfully, this determination could be made tomorrow. And Greta, I wanted to say I really welcome the forward movement in Congress in particular. I think a lot of times we isolate our conceptualization of the US government to only the executive branch, but you have so many different actors, even within the executive branch, so many different actors in Congress, and of course this very meeting here that highlights the important role of NGOs and civil society in moving forward.
And you'd get even faster forward movement in all parts of the government and the world if the media would use its huge spotlight. I mean, there's enormous power, and then we go back to where I started is, where are they? They know about the never again, but where is the media? Why aren't they all over this story? Because if they're all over this story, I assure you, the government's going to react faster, the UN's going to react faster, more things are going to go on around the world, more nations are going to stand up, and if sanctions is something that should be considered worldwide, by different nations, to tell you one thing, with that giant spotlight, but they're not there.
But I also think, to add on to that, I think that this is This is a reflection of what's happened with the Rohingya community internationally and its profile for at least since I've been covering it since 2006. The Rohingya burst into the news because of some atrocity that takes place, and then they evaporate from the news just as easy. And then they burst into the news because something else has happened against them. That's another atrocity has happened, and the news just completely dissipates. I mean, I think what you've seen since end of last year is that there has been more press coverage, but the fact is that the scale of what's happened is so enormous that I agree with you. I don't know why there isn't more media coverage on a sustained basis of what's been happening there.
I've never seen anyone who hasn't seen this who isn't absolutely outraged.
Well, I mean, to be honest with you, that's exactly what was one of my motivators in 2006, is that I just could not believe that something like this had been happening to a community.
One of the challenges that we face is there are crises where we have considerable media attention. I mean, we're joined tonight by a remarkable colleague, Mansour Omari is in the back, and if you have the chance to go up to our contemporary exhibit on Syria, it tells about the horrific experience that he and many of his friends and colleagues had where they were detained, tortured. Mansour carried out on his body physically 5 pieces of cloth with the names of those that he was detained with. We have more information coming out in real time in Syria and such a lack of action. In the case of the Rohingya, I think there has been a deficit in attention, but we know what's been happening. Where I'm curious is on the policy side, we need to be able to galvanize political will, and often to galvanize political will, you need public pressure. People need to be getting phone calls from their constituents in Kansas and Indiana, in LA and elsewhere, and they're not on this issue. I think it's been great to see recently that the community dedicated to international religious freedoms has been speaking out about the Rohingya and showing a cross-faith, multi-faith approach to it. But we still have to be able to invest in a commitment to long-term atrocity prevention, have a policy process in place that's prioritized so that the people who are sitting, the desk officers, the folks in the White House, they are looking at these issues for cases where there is going to be a risk of genocide and have got the response in hand.
You know, but there's several issues. One of the warning signs, and we know it's going to happen. I mean, there's sort of classic warning signals. You've got the 1982 Constitution in Myanmar where they had 135 ethnic groups could be citizens, but not the Rohingya. I mean, that was a classic one. But then you've got the crisis. You've got, like in August of 2017, when 700,000 people in all these villages are burned, women are raped, and they've got their babies ripped out of arms and thrown in fires. You've got that. Well, then now you've got this camp. And you've got the predictable thing that's happened. So it's a horrible, I mean, it's a terrible economic burden on Bangladesh. I mean, I don't know how long Bangladesh can endure this. And you've got the fact that in order to survive, they've stripped the whole area of all the vegetation to build homes and to build fuel. And then you've got the rains that come. We can see that in our video. And then you've got the monsoons. Now you've got mudslides. And Bangladesh won't let them get education. So naturally, they're sitting in this camp prisoners. And naturally, there's a lot of dissension. Those that get out want to undercut the Bangladesh for jobs, so now the Bangladesh aren't getting the jobs, and they're mad at the Rohingyas who have come into their country. I mean, it's the same pattern in every refugee camp.
But I also think that, you know, one thing that is really easy for people to completely take their eye off the ball on here is that you've got 700,000 Rohingya in Bangladesh, 1.5 million spread out throughout countries all across Asia and elsewhere. But what you have is you still have this community that is still living in Rakhine State of 500,000 Rohingya, the last bastion of this community that has lived there for centuries, you know? And in so many ways, the plight of what continues to happen to them every single day is being lost in this humanitarian disaster that continues to be talked about in Bangladesh, for good reason. But what you have here is, when you think about it that way, the centerpiece of all of this rests with Naypyidaw. It rests with what's happening inside of Burma, where there is deep-rooted racism against this community on a systematic level. And how do you change racism and discrimination? The hardest thing. Policies might be able to do one thing, but how do you change a racist, intolerant government that is basically led by one ethnic community imposing itself and its identity upon an entire nation of people, ethnic community.
For starters, is that you inform people about it. That's starters.
Exactly.
And then we make the decision whether you can always have force, but that's very unpopular, and I got that, and that has another set of complicated things. But we don't necessarily have to do business with these people.
I agree with you too, Greta. I do.
But the thing is, we've got to have a dialogue about it. And if go back to I'm a broken record on this. If the media isn't creating that dialogue, we don't have that dialogue to figure out what might be a possible solution.
Well, let's tackle that just from two different perspectives. I mean, one, there's the question of what needs to happen in terms of the international community's response, and maybe more specifically, the U.S. government. And then I think the second is the domestic efforts within the country that have to be undertaken. And Tun Khin, I think you could probably speak to those, but maybe just starting with the U.S. government. Olivia, do you want to kind of share your thoughts on what some of the policy responses could be?
Yeah. I mean, I think the dream scenario would be to have the U.S. government issue a determination that genocide has in fact taken place. I mean, for those in the audience, if you haven't yet read it, the PILPG report that they came out this week with, it really built upon what the State Department had already released in terms of the atrocities report in Rakhine State, but they did the tough legal analysis that needs to be done to determine that genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, et cetera, has in fact taken place. But I think the dream scenario is not only the U.S. issues a determination, but that determination comes with follow-on Treasury action that specifically targets Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, who we have so much evidence, was basically the architect of everything that we saw taking place. And not just him, that you would also see other senior military officials being sanctioned. I mean, it's great. Already there have been global Magnitsky sanctions. Global Magnitsky allows the U.S. government to target individuals on human rights and corruption grounds. We've seen those, the 33rd and the 99th Light Infantry divisions, which we know played a significant role in the crisis, already designated. These are really important actions, but there's got to be follow-on. It has to be consistent, and it has to be a broader part of our foreign policy with Burma. When we look at our Burma strategy, the priority has got to be to really get Burma back on the path toward democratic reform, and that means, again, addressing the serious impunity of the Burmese military. I think only then can you really help Aung San Suu Kyi to push the country in a proper direction, one that hopefully could respect the rights of Rohingya and other minorities who are being targeted.
Do you mind if I add something on to that? I think that I think you're totally right, but at the same time, a common question that always comes up to me whenever I have an exhibition or whenever do a talk is, what about Aung San Suu Kyi? Where does she stand in all this? Why is she doing anything? You know what? The reality of it is, the world has given her a chance. She's had a chance to stand up and do something different, yet she's chosen not to. And this is, I think, the greatest failure of her in this position, is that, yes, we know that the Constitution in Burma is so weighted on the military's benefit, that policies are so hard to change. But the fact is that one thing that she can do is to help change and reshape people's minds. Yet she has not done one thing to try to articulate that. And that is, until that really happens, I think that until people in the country really change their mind frame of racism towards this particular community, particularly the military, they're going to constantly be, everybody's going to constantly have problems in trying to find a solution to this. And that's one of the biggest things that everybody asks me whenever I talk, and my experience of talking with people. And when you talk with Rohingya now, I mean, Tun Khin, it's amazing how you've talked about in the past, about how the Rohingya in past elections had the right to vote, and voted in favor of the NLD, and voted in favor of Aung San Suu Kyi, believing in these democratic...
I myself campaigned in this city in 2009, 10, 11, for her release and other political prisoners. And today she is not speaking up. Instead, her government minister last 2 days ago spreading hate speech against Rohingyas and other Muslims in Burma. This is what's happening. We have to look at. She's totally complicit. I
mean, I think sometimes we, at times, have kind of overly simplistic ideas of how we think that we can either bring to an end a conflict or a genocide and kind of enact social change within a country, whereas the response really has to be very, very multifaceted at the local level, domestic, regional, international, and ideally, if there was some degree of coordination between all the various entities, that might lead to more positive outcomes. But Tun Khin, going back to this question about how do you affect change within the country, because there's been a very deliberate effort to slowly strip away the rights of the Rohingya and also to change the way in which neighbors view neighbors. You were able to vote in the past. You did have citizenship in the past. There was more freedom of movement in the past. I mean, what are the types of changes that need to happen within the country?
First thing, I have to focus on two ways. First, when you talk about genocide, practically, we need immediately physical protection. When, as I mentioned, people are fleeing, even this weekend, some people are waiting to flee by boat from Rakhine State. So, these Rohingya in IDP camps and northern Arakan State and Choctaw, southern part of Arakan, the whole Arakan state, 500,000 Rohingyas, their lives are at risk. How we can protect them? This is a very important point. Of course, we need to look at the root cause of the problem. First thing, they taken away our citizenship. So citizenship is very important. They must restore our citizenship, and it is needed for the peaceful coexistence. Government need to come up something to get kind of peaceful working with other ethnic groups, and they have to recognize the Rohingya. This is very important because government is saying Rohingya not exist. So for me, to be honest, as UN fact-finding mission mentioned, there is I don't think any solution very soon coming from Burma. The solution need to come up from international community.
Mm-hmm. Greta, maybe switching to you. I mean, you're a former prosecutor.
Defense attorney, but I know a lot of prosecutors.
Oh, sorry.
They were always after me.
Defense attorney. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the importance of accountability. I mean, a common theme that has come up in everyone's comments is about impunity. And that seems to be where a lot of the emphasis right now is focusing when we talk about international responses. I was curious what your perspective is.
First of all, let me speak personally, not at VOA, doing my working on this documentary that VOA did. This is just my personal opinion. We have the International Criminal Tribunal. Of course, the United States is not a signature to the treaty, so we're not part of the ICC. Some people have hoped that the ICC was the answer, and I'm deeply disappointed in the ICC. It's been rather feckless. It has not been able to, for instance, it issued a genocide indictment in 2010 for Bashir of Sudan, and they've never been able to capture him and bring him to justice. And he's also been to South Africa, he's been to Chad and to other nations that are signatories to the treaty, and those countries should have picked him up. So I'm out of the justice business in terms of getting these people some international forum, just because of the history. I just don't see it. I see the best chance, and this is in the most unthinkable thing. We have the video show you the most unthinkable conditions. This is post being run out of Burma. Is getting the internet, getting the world to talk about this. It really is, and it seems silly, tweets and stuff like that, but it really does. It just keeps it in the public domain. It keeps people talking about it, because this is such an important issue to get to get our collective. The collective nations talking about. The U.S. can't do this alone. No nation can. And so I don't see criminal justice as a means to solving this, because I'm disappointed with the forum that's out there that some have looked to. I look instead to shame, peer pressure, sanctions. Look, I mean, this is terrible, but you go into Burma and you mention the word Rohingya, and they all look at you like, they won't let you say the word. I mean, these are non-people; they don't exist. Even the Pope was disappointed. He was in Myanmar, and he wouldn't use the term. And he's a very courageous guy. This is an issue that is being deeply ignored by so many.
Mm-hmm. Or very much catering to the narrative of the Burmese authorities and the continued denial of the existence of the Rohingya from their perspective.
Well, where's the Nobel Peace Prize Committee? There has been some discussion about taking the prize back from Aung San Suu Kyi, and she still got it. Our U.S. Congress gave her a big award. She still got it. She came to the United States and she got the royal treatment because we had so much hope for her, but she has failed. And, I'm sorry that she has failed, although it has enormous consequence for the Rohingya, hundreds of thousands of people.
Before we go to the video, I did want to just, though, ask Tun Khin the question on the importance of accountability, because we've heard that the military and military commanders are nervous that they will be held accountable at some stage. We've also heard from local Rohingya, from various community groups as well, that for them it's very important to see individuals held responsible for the crimes that they have committed. I'm curious just what your perspective is.
Yes, that is very important. First, as I mentioned, from the victims, what I heard from the refugee camps, the first thing they told me is justice. Their sisters been gang raped, their brothers been slaughtered, and their children been burned alive. So, that me online is important because now there is sanctions other militaries. He was not there. He is the person who mentioned is unfinished business of 1942 to Washington Post. So he is the main commander, and the
commander-in-chief.
Commander-in-chief. So, and that is also important that the whole, as UN fact-finding mission have mentioned, as a whole Burma, if you need to see, we need to see that this institution, military, they are going along with these murders because international community is not taking any action. They can go along with that.
So there has to be this kind of consideration of the costs and consequences of actually committing atrocities. When you work and function in an environment where there is no responsibility for crimes that you've committed, it becomes a tool that one can resort to as a means of controlling populations or driving out certain populations, as we've seen in other situations. And though there might be no one perfect forum, and I think in this particular case there's a lot of conversation around, could there be a hybrid tribunal? Is there alternative?
I wish. I mean, I hope you're right. I've just got to, I'm cynical after being disappointed. That's all. I hope you're right. I'd love to
appreciate that you're joining the choir of disappointment here. I think it would be fair to say that all of us feel some degree of disappointment in many of the tools that we have all in some way been part of trying to either build or move forward. I've spent a decade working on something called the responsibility to protect, which means that governments have a responsibility to protect communities from genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and it's with immense humility that we're gathered here today, again, over 70 years after the creation of the UN Convention on the Punishment and Prevention of Genocide, that we see these crimes occurring. So I think that unfortunately, we are still trying to understand both the phenomenon of how and why these atrocities occur and how you stop them. In the case, I think, to the point that you've been making and stressing, Greg, the focus needs to be on the communities that remain within the country and that are imperiled within the country. And then in addition, those that are living outside in really difficult circumstances. We're going to just turn right now to a video from Voice of America just to show you a little bit of the context. It's right now the largest refugee camp in the world, and we've got a short clip.
Here comes the rain.
Yeah, we can go there. Come on.
Can I get under your thing for a second? This is what the million people, the million Rohingyas in this refugee camp are having to put up with. This is the monsoon season. This is a crisis on top of a crisis. It is raining like crazy. It's not going to stop raining. This is no ordinary rain. This is a monsoon. And what's happening, what's already happened, is there are mudslides. But that's not where it stops. I mean, look, here's a latrine, but the latrines are filthy. The danger is clear to relief workers like May Sepan of Food for the Hungry and Medical Teams International.
Essentially, their settlements are built on what appears to be sand dunes because they're deforested lands that have no way of protecting the population against the monsoon rains. And so it's very likely that most of these settlements will get washed out as the rains increase and the storms become more intense.
Not every Rohingya was able to escape to Bangladesh. Many, numbers unknown, were murdered, slaughtered. The United Nations has identified these vicious acts as ethnic cleansing. You've heard the phrase, never again. But those words ring hollow here. It has happened again to the Rohingyas.
Thank you. With that incredibly moving video that puts us right into the center of where now over 1 million people are living in incredibly desperate conditions, I think the reality of the conversation is we're talking about one where this will be prolonged displacement. I know that many don't want to talk about it that way, but the reality is to repatriate them back to Burma would be to put them back into a situation where they're going to face genocide and other atrocity crimes, because we've simply seen no change in the behavior of the military or the civilian government towards the Rohingya, nor a change in the sentiments of the public. We now have a situation, I think when Greta made the documentary, the UN had come out with its initial findings. We now have a situation where they've clearly said they believe that there's reasonable grounds to believe genocide was committed. As Olivia mentioned, this week, the Public International Law and Policy Group issued a report. They undertook the State Department documentation effort. That report's available online, where they outline, again, the case that they believe that can be made that genocide occurred. And we're having this conversation in a context where there is considerable debate about whether or not the US government should recognize the crimes as being genocide, where there's a considerable conversation about what the policy implications would be for that, and where I think the reality is for all of us here on the stage, what we'd like to see is actually preventive action taken. While it's important to call the crimes for what they are, and that in itself can have a compelling impact in terms of helping to put more pressure on the Chinese, put more pressure on the Burmese military, what we would like to see is actually action. And so I'm going to open it up just to questions from the audience. I believe there are 2 microphones that are available for the audience. My colleague Molly has one over on the right, and Rachel over on the left. Questions? Let's see. There's one here in the front. Oh, I'm sorry. I'd like to actually just very quickly, Amanda, if you don't mind. Amanda, just at the very front, the director of Voice of America.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank everybody here for being here and thank the organization here for sponsoring this. It's been very, very powerful, all of you. I'd like to frame my question around the words never again, which we heard Greta utter here, which this entire building was built to dedicate for, which many of you have dedicated your lives to. I think that when we think about never again, we think about a lot of us tend to judge history and the people who failed to help Mrs. Weiss here and her family, and we think about that. I've heard a lot of disappointment and cynicism about the organizations that we're talking about, the government, NGOs, courts, lawyers. Could you, 50 years from now, when people look back on all of us in this room, could you each suggest something that we could do so as not to be judged by history?
We started with a really easy question for everyone, and probably the most important question for each of us to ask. So thank you very much, Amanda, for that. Tun Khin, why don't we start with you?
First thing is the question is about what can they do? Is it media, or as you mentioned, you're from Voice of America, I don't know, media, or as a people?
The American public, the average person? Anyone in this room?
First thing, it is important that, as you mentioned, is after 70 years, never again. This is happening genocide, minority Rohingya people in Burma they are facing. It is important that people write in America here. They have to write to senators and congressmen to push administration first thing to recognize that and call for justice and accountability and call for targeted sanctions and provide protection. That's kind of right. And also here institutions and medias, it is important that, as Greta have mentioned, need to, whoever, if they are right, they can write op-ed, and this is to need to be on top of everyone need to talk about, so can write articles and others. And also it is important if institution that is, we have to keep alive this story, because we cannot, this is still ongoing. This is 21st century modern genocide. So that's what should do.
Olivia.
Yeah. So I think that one of the things that often gets overlooked, especially here in Washington, is the important role of civil society and individuals in facilitating change. When I think through my own life, I think about, I have so many friends who will ask me about my work and I'll end up talking about it. Even those simple conversations can be incredibly informative. But also, I think there's a role for not just NGOs or individuals, but also faith-based communities. I go to church here in Washington. I mean, maybe consider whether or not your church or your religious organization or community organization that you're a part of could maybe give up a week of vacation time or 2 weeks of vacation time to even go out to these camps and to volunteer your time. And then take the information that you have from that and consider, is there anything I can do here back in Washington? Maybe call my senator or my representative and ask them to take action. I think it's so important to keep it in the conversation, and I think media has an important role to do, certainly in educating people and continuing to drive the conversation forward, but it has a lot to do with us as individuals just continuing to talk about it and saying, this is something we think our government should place a priority on.
Greta, can you maybe articulate why the public, why the average American should care about what's happening to the Rohingya?
Because we're good people. For the same reason that, that we have this museum. Because, we're good people. And, I don't think there's a single person who could walk through that camp that wouldn't feel the same way as everyone else who's been through that. I actually urge you, and not just because Voice America did this documentary, but it's on YouTube, it's free, is to watch the documentary, because you go to that camp. You meet people, you see what is, and because, we are fundamentally, we're really good people. We get busy in our lives, and I don't expect everybody out here, spend the rest of your life, campaigning for the Rohingya, but it takes, for the media, do you know how long it takes? Like, you take anyone in the media, any one of my colleagues, we all have over 1 million followers on Twitter. How long do you think it takes to tweet and to spread the word? How long would it take to put the link out from our VOA if they don't want to talk about it? When it takes you inside the camp, it takes a second. And I know the more that we are informed, the more we're talking about it, the more we're really going to want to change things and help things. Because there isn't a single person that wants this to go on. Not a single person. I mean, the atrocities. I mean, we put up the dirty latrine. That's just, we sanitized it a little bit for you, because the dirty latrine. You know what the dirty latrine is? And the next step is cholera. And then we have other diseases. And thankfully, we have good souls like Doctors Without Borders, Samaritan's Purse, CARE. We have so many NGOs that are over there trying to do stuff, but it's just too overwhelming. And it's really late on the chain, because you have to stop the genocide before it occurs, not at the tail end when you're trying to pick up the pieces.
Greg?
I mean, it's a loaded question. I mean, I think everybody's put forth good suggestions. I mean, I still believe that reading, listening, and hearing is probably the most important things that anybody can do. I mean, really, I mean, we live in this superficial world of social media, which really doesn't have much substance to it, to be honest with you. It's beyond just flipping your thumb through your iPhone. I mean, it's actually clicking on a New Yorker piece about something like this. It's actually clicking and reading a New York Times piece or a Washington Post piece or The Intercept or whoever, or watching the VOA piece. I mean, it's actually, that is probably the biggest starting point for so many of us. But yet, we live in this hyperactive world that distracts us from being able to do that. And I think that if we look beyond this superficial world that we're living in, social media, you actually end up seeing that these are human beings, that they all have names, that they all have their husbands or wives or mothers or fathers or uncles or aunts or grandparents, and their kids have names, and we should know their names, and we should know their stories, and we should know why their story is important for us to know, because in some small way, all of us, thousands of miles away in comfy little United States, there's something that we can relate to in that humanity between what's happened to them and what we would never want to lose. And it's our responsibility through pure solidarity to say that that's intolerable. And I think that for me, that is probably, as a photographer, I know where my limits are in terms of what I can do. I try to push that limit every single year. But I also know that the starting point comes from people wanting to know, being informed, and then that allows them to ask questions.
And one other thing, to Greg's point about reading, if there's anyone in the audience who hasn't read the UN fact-finding mission or hasn't read even just a small portion of the PILPG report on this issue, honestly, I mean, I would highly commend it to you. I know it's a very nerdy ask, but I think it's one worth undertaking because the gravity of what took place there, the gravity of what individual Rohingya experienced, it comes through in those reports. And it's hard to leave. I work on a variety of human rights issues at Heritage, and I sat in my office and cried while I read the PILPG report. It's really important that we read these.
Or you could just, if you can't read a report because you got a busy day, how about Greg's pictures? I mean, they tell you everything. You know, that's what I mean. Is it really, and that's really, I think, where the media's fallen down. So I think, you know, it's sort of incumbent upon everybody else to get involved. And his pictures tell you a big story.
I think what's crucial is that that we not talk about this in the past tense. You know, that we don't talk about the Rohingya in the past tense. Because this is something that, even though there's a historical legacy that has brought everything to this awful point to where it is, the fact is that this is still something that is happening right now in the present tense today, and it will be happening tomorrow. And the more informed we are, the more questions we ask, the more we take heed of these suggestions that everybody has talked about. The fact is that we're contributing to something that actually is still happening today and will be continuing to happen for who knows how long, because the solutions are so far away in sight.
And if we don't see real concrete change, and change fairly soon, we're also going to see other communities continue to be targeted, perhaps not by genocide, but by crimes against humanity and war crimes, as we've seen in Burma's history and as is happening today. I want to open it up just to a few more questions. I think we'll take two at a time. Sorry, I'm having a hard time seeing, but I believe that there's some questions in the back. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to offer one thing everyone can do. There's a couple of hundred people here tonight. If we tweeted before we left this room, that would be tens of thousands of people that would at least be exposed to something. Greta, is there a hashtag for your documentary?
John Lippman's here. He can help us the most. Displaced, is that what it is? It's got a VOA website. I mean, a YouTube link. We'll have to get you that. Promise you that, because, you know, oops.
Hashtag Rohingya, I guess.
Right. But it's on YouTube under the, you know, displaced is the slug.
I just turned on the Wi-Fi. The code is remember. So it's UHHMM, and the code is remember. You mentioned about, so encourage everybody to do something before they leave here tonight. You mentioned it's continuing. 2 months ago, there were 40 churches burned, Christian churches burned in Burma. These thugs are doing it to other minorities. It's going to continue, and this isn't going away. This is about justice, and we have to do something.
Exactly. And I mean, I think the fact that there has been so little consequences for individual perpetrators, but also for the military at large, is one of the drivers of continued atrocities in Burma. We've just established a new forensic justice initiative that is working to bring together a diverse group of Burmese voices and organizations to try to help pursue efforts, both domestically and internationally, to hold those perpetrators accountable and try to raise the cost. But as we said before, that has to be just one of many policy responses that are undertaken, and we have to be engaged in this conversation not for 5 months or 5 years, but probably for 5 decades to a certain degree, which I know makes people very uncomfortable. But there are no easy answers to how you solve the commission of genocide or prevent it. And I think there's a certain level of honesty that we need. In the conversation of what can be done, I'm going to just also encourage you to go to our website. There's a considerable amount of resources on Burma there. There's also links to the earlywarningproject.org that our team runs, of which Burma has been either at the top or close to the top for the entire time that we have had that initiative running. It looks at early warning signs of mass killing. And you can go on there and learn more about what the indicators are and the factors and the different kind of methodology used to identify situations where there's a risk of mass killing. I think the question that we all need to ask as you leave this room and as you go forward is, what is the responsibility of not just ourselves, but our governments to heed those early warnings and to try to take policy that helps to save lives? I'm going to open it up just to a few more questions. I see over on the right, there's 3 hands, and then over on the left as well. Let's go to the right.
Hi. Thank you all for speaking tonight. My name's Namrata, and my question is primarily for Greta. There was an article in the New York Times last week about the ethical dilemmas that journalists often face when going to places of extreme suffering like Yemen. And Greta, if you're willing to share, I'd be curious to hear from you as an experienced journalist about any of the ethical questions you've struggled with over the years when traveling to places of suffering like Burma, primarily to bear witness and report.
Thank you for that question. I have a crutch when I go to these places. I have a camera, so the things that I probably don't want to talk about or can't talk about, or if I don't want to ask someone about, is the camera, the lens tells the story. It's very effective. Plus, it puts people right there on the spot. Ethical dilemma. I hate to ask. I hate to stand next to someone who's obviously. I stood next to someone who looked about 16, who had 4 kids. I don't know, she looked pretty young, and her husband had been murdered in front of her kids. And I don't want to say what's it like? What a terrible thing to ask someone. Yet at the same time, I want her to tell me, and I want her to tell me, as close to what it was like, so that it's captured on a camera, so that people can understand it, because I'm the eyes and the ears when I go there. So my ethical dilemma is that I want to sort of, I want to console the person. I don't want to push the person's buttons, but I find that I want to effectively report, and I want to get the story as raw and ugly as it is. So I think that's probably my biggest challenge is I want to tell you exactly like it is, but it's I feel bad asking some of the questions I ask of people.
Greg, do you mind sharing your perspective?
Yeah, I think that the challenge that you're always faced with is, in the back of my head, to be honest with you, it's always knowing that the work that I do is never going to be enough, to be honest with you. People want to tell their stories, as painful as they might be. Almost all the Rohingya that I've ever met over all these years, they want their stories told. And they want you to be the one to try to tell that and expose that to people. But I also find, and as long as people are wanting to talk with me, I'll listen to their story, and I'll try to present it in the most responsible way that I possibly can, however painful it might be. But it's also this fact of knowing that just as they've told me this horrible story about a moment of their life or a period of their life, knowing that just getting it published in a magazine or a newspaper is just not enough. It's how else can we as journalists funnel the work into a number of different ways outside of the traditional? You know, how can we get it beyond just the pages of a newspaper or a magazine or a radio interview or a TV show? Because I always believe that it's just not enough.
Yeah, I'm going to maybe just jump in.
There's also the problem that at least I have is a cultural difference. You know, it's like I'm a Western woman, and you know, and other people, the Rohingya are Muslims, and when you see what happens to the Muslim women, you know, especially late at night when it gets dark, and you know, you think to yourself, you know, that a Western woman might be in a different situation, you know, and you want to be respectful, yet you want to be protective. So I think this sort of cultural differences sometimes makes it troubling to do the job.
But I also think, I'll add one more thing to you, Greta, too, is that I also think that we're at a really unique time, and I don't know how Tun Khin feel about this. This comes from my just subjective experience. But I think we're at this very exciting time for the entire Rohingya community worldwide. Given all the atrocities that's happened in at least the 13 years that I've been working on documenting the Rohingya, you've never seen so many Rohingya organizations spread out around the world, like your organization in the UK, or the Rohingya organization in Australia, or the Rohingya organization in Canada, or Rohingya organizations in Chicago or Portland, Oregon. I mean, these are all places where Rohingya are banding together now to claim their own voice on this story instead of having Westerners be the one exposing it to them.
But it's so itty-bitty to the magnitude of the problem.
But still, I think what's exciting about it is that we as journalists are also in a position to be able to help funnel our work into what the Rohingya community is doing too, and that's very exciting.
Tun Khin, do you mind responding to the question on kind of ethical considerations and, as Greg said, this moment of the voice of the Rohingya being able to actually be at the forefront versus our voices being at the forefront?
That is very important, actually, because we have seen we've been sidelined, even in Burma and outside also, like even, let me bring you UNHCR and UNDP and Burmese government, they sign, agreement. There is no consultation with the Rohingya, first thing. And outside also, the other side, that is about political issue. And the other side, whenever many NGOs in Cox's Bazar, and there need to be, there are a lot of NGOs, they look, supporting Rohingya victims. But it is important that victim voice need to be heard. And forefront, whatever they do, they have to consult with the Rohingya. We have not seen that much that, honestly.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just as Tun Khin was mentioning, there was a repatriation agreement that was signed between the government of Bangladesh and Myanmar, which did not involve consultation with the local community. And when they tried to enact it, no one agreed to return to Burma because there was no change in the conditions on the ground. And just to the point on the ethical concerns, that's something that our institution feels very strongly about. I think there is, unfortunately, a serious problem that exists not just within the field of journalism, but even within the human rights community in terms of a very, at times, exploitive, one-way, extractive approach to the way in which we go in, get information, try to tell the stories, document what happens, and then never go back to the communities and share with them what the outputs were. I've worked with people who unfortunately have lost family members because their family members were killed in the course of talking to journalists or human rights advocates. Walked into camps where someone comes up and says, "Do you want to talk to my sister? She was the rape survivor," because that's what journalists go in and ask for. There has to be clear standards. There has to be standards that are enacted and upheld not just by the human rights field, but also by the international media outlets, because though we need to tell the story, we have to do one in a way that is responsible and that has the best interests of the affected communities. It is our efforts to try to amplify your voices, and it's your voices that should be privileged in the conversations. So thank you for asking that question because it is so important. We're going to take two last questions before we go outside to see the photos. There's someone waving their hand over on the right, and then please over on the left, Rachel. Why don't we start, Rachel, with you on the left, since you...
Hi, so I actually recently spent some time in Cox's Bazar at one of the camps. And I did go with the privilege of being a Muslim female. So what Greta said, I 1000% agree with her. In talking to some of my colleagues, I realized I was able to get a lot more than some of my male colleagues that had gone, because I came from a perspective that a lot of the women there, a lot of the young girls, and a lot of the children were able to really open up without that fear. And I think it's very important to respect the stories of the people that are there, because often journalists go and it becomes almost invigorating as a photographer, and you cannot forget that just by giving them a form to sign something, they may not understand what the internet is. They may not know where their story's going. I think it's really important to explain in a way that they will understand. And my question goes into the aspect of sustainable solutions, where we often see a lot of Westerners will go in for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, it's nice, and then they leave. It's not enough. And one of the biggest things is empowering that community and empowering the Rohingya community. And that begins with education, which is a huge, huge problem within the camps, because schools are not allowed there. And so you see this community where after the age of 10, they have the learning centers, which goes till the age of 10. And after that, you get a bunch of teenagers who feel stuck, that they cannot do anything. And so they want to empower themselves. And I think coming from the United States, we have the privilege of being educated. And what we need to kind of push for, in my opinion, is a huge kind of push to the Bangladeshi government to allow education, figure out a way to get the young people that are in camp, give them a chance. Yes, meanwhile, we can create awareness here, and it's very important. But right now, there's a serious crisis happening there, and you have years and years of people not becoming educated.
Thank you for that really important question. We are at risk of losing not just one generation, but multiple generations. And that is an important point that we'll turn to. Just for the last final question, we'll take the 2 last questions at a time. I believe there was someone on the right. Hi, Simon.
Yeah, my name's Simon Billines, and you know, we had a lot of good discussion. Had a lot of discussion about what people could do, about how we can lobby our members of Congress to put effective sanctions on the Burmese army and put other forms of pressure. There's also a lot of forms of economic pressure. The Burmese army dominates the trade in gems from Burma, rubies and jade. And there's been a new effort, no business with genocide, to get the big jewelers to stop buying gems that profit the Burmese army. And this is a form of citizen sanctions that we can enact ourselves. We don't necessarily have to go through our government to do this. So I was wondering if you could, anyone on the panel could talk a little bit more about the Burmese army's business interests, and how we can also take action in our role as consumers and investors, as well as our role as citizens.
Can I take a quick stab
Thank you,
at that?
Simon.
I think it's a great idea to have the consumer stuff. I mean, I'm speaking as myself. I mean, I like to have the citizens get active like that. But I'll just back it up though. And the reason I don't know about, I remember the gems now because I remember I was there. That all the gems in Bangladesh. But it's because who knows about it? And the reason we don't know about it is because the media is not reporting it. I mean, if there'd be a lot more activity. Believe me, if we all knew more about it.
Yes, but I will say that there has been, and Simon's been involved in this too, a lot of effort done to document those causal links and share that information with the U.S. government, with other governments, with the corporations themselves. There are court cases that have been enacted and taken forward with the United Nations. So the information is there if people wanted to act. I think your point on needing to compel action and putting public pressure on failure to act.
We need to help him.
And create more momentum. Just turning over just to Olivia.
So on the first question, I just wanted to say I completely agree with you. I think we do have to look at, in the short term, what are the urgent needs of individuals who are inside of these camps. And I actually think this is part of the reason why it's so important for the U.S. government to issue a determination now. Because I think issuing a determination now means that not only will that put the impetus on, of course, the U.S. to continue to provide humanitarian assistance as donor fatigue sets in just 1 year, after these atrocities were committed, but they frankly continue today. But hopefully that can encourage other countries as well to step up and actually help provide humanitarian assistance, because we are falling far short of what is needed in these communities. And then to the second question from Simon, yeah, I know that you've done absolutely fantastic work on these particular issues. I think this is another reason why we should also continue to target Senior General Min Aung Hlaing and some of the other Burmese officials, but why not go after those industries that are leading the military to profit and helping to prop them up and to prop their sort of power base up in a really meaningful way. So I'm glad you brought that up.
And I think that's an incredibly important policy consideration right now, to be able to map out who are the perpetrators, what are the levers that exist, and what are the tools that we can use to try to influence their behavior and deter them from committing these crimes going forward. Just to close, Tun Khin, I wanted to give you the last word if you wanted to respond to those last questions or any of the previous questions.
And someone mentioned about empowering community. That is one of the demand from the refugee camps as a Rohingya, as a genocide survivor myself. It is important that we need to counteract to rebuild the community. It is extremely important. We do not want to see our community on the wrong hand. You know, the atmosphere there in Bangladesh is not a healthy atmosphere. There are thousands of Rohingya students. They want to get education. They can speak up. We can do a lot of. We can train them. We can build them up for the community to speak. Rohingya can speak themselves. You know. So they can speak their story. We have to train them as how they can lead the community. This is very important. Thanks for that comment. And for the Simon one, I think it is, of course, important that we need to look at the sanctions being, you know, if you look at the history in Burma before 2010, why military came to a kind of democratic to the whole election in 2000, because they can feel the pressure. So we have to look at particular those what military related these sanctions. We need to be point out. We need to talk to the government. We need to push pressure to the governments. And finally, you want to tell me something? I thought U.S. government. This is very important. We need to. Still, we have not seen U.S. government come up. What we are talking about? What is happening to our community is genocide. We haven't seen any State Department have done the report, but didn't come up still with a genocide or so. First thing, they must determine. They must call it what is it, and it is important that time is running out. 3 million Rohingya and 500 Rohingyas only left in Burma. So is the US government and international community will act when the last Rohingya left in Arkan state? So how many Rohingya needs to be killed to force to take an action? Forcing them to take an action. Because as a Rohingya myself, I need to be frank. Of course, justice and accountability, sanctions, and bring protection. It is important. First thing, immediately need to act how intervene to stop this genocide. We have talked it's never again, but this is happening now, after 70 years. So we have not seen UN fact-finding mission briefed in UN Security Council, 25th of October. Genocide is ongoing. What is happening to the Rohingya community is a genocide. But still we have not seen any action from international community. So international community must come together with collective action to act to stop this genocide. Otherwise, Rohingya will not be anymore in our country, in Burma. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tun Khin, for those incredibly powerful concluding words. I want to take a moment to thank all of you for coming tonight. I'd like to thank the team here at the museum. We are actually, because of today's holiday, many of the people who are here are volunteering their time or staying overtime to be able to work. I'd like to specifically thank my colleagues Jennifer Schmidt and Jackie Scutari for all their hard work today. Colleague Andrea Gittleman, who has doggedly over the last few years worked on putting a spotlight and doing analysis on the plight of the Rohingya. I'd like to also thank all of the people in the room who, many of you have been working on this issue for years, for decades. Some of you have been working on it outside in NGOs, some of you have been working it in the State Department, and I just want to say you are the unsung heroes in this particular situation, and I think we are all committed and resolved to continue to work together to try to amplify the voices of Tun Khin and the 3 million others who continue to, unfortunately, face a very grave risk of genocide. So I want to thank you all for your work. It is a shame that we have to be here to have this conversation in the first place, and though it's not a perfect solution, the US government has been trying to increasingly prioritize atrocity prevention within the government. They created an atrocity prevention board, which was supposed to look at the early warning signs and develop specific policies to try to mitigate the risks. It faces an unclear future at this point, and one of the things that you can do is learn more about what your own government has committed to do and convey to those who have influence that you think the US government should continue to be a leader on atrocity prevention so that we do not have to be here in another 10, 20, 30 years talking about yet another community that has faced a risk of atrocities. I think the fact that we have to be here and have Irene set the context and help us underscore why this is so critically important, unfortunately shows why today it remains as urgent as ever to try to ensure that the notion of never again actually really means something. So with that, I'd like to invite everyone to go outside. We're going to be showing the images of Greg Constantine's incredible work on the outside of the museum. You're also going to be able to hear the voices and the music of Rohingya musicians, thanks to the work of an organization called Music in Exile. And these photos will be on the outside of the museum, and the music will be on the outside of the museum for the next week. Both Greg is here and also Alex and Sasha from Music in Exile. Of course, the museum staff are at your disposal to ask more questions, as will some of the panelists. So thank you very much for being here. Much appreciated.